Welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye, where I get to talk in depth with some of the most interesting contemporary photographers working today about their latest projects. I'm David Oresick, the Executive Director of Silver Eye Center for Photography. Silver Eye works to promote the power of contemporary photography as a fine art medium by creating original exhibitions, unique educational programming like this series, and through the lab at Silver Eye, a space for artists to learn, create, and connect. You can visit us online at silvereye.org to learn more about all of our programs and find a fun and helpful glossary for these conversations. You can also learn more about our biggest and most important fundraiser, the Silver Eye Benefit Auction. Now more than ever, this fundraiser is absolutely crucial to everything we do. The auction allows us to produce our exhibitions, pay our artists, produce artist talks, publications, podcasts, and so much more. The auction also allows us to make all of these programs free and open to all. If you listen to these conversations, if you come to the gallery, if you value new, original, and diverse artwork in our community, then I am asking you to please check out the auction on our website and consider placing a bid on a photograph you love or buy a ticket to our virtual preview party. The photographs that artists have donated are so incredible, and there is truly something for everyone to fall in love with. If there is one thing I can endorse, it's living with art you love in your home. Usually the auction is a live event and it's so much fun, but because of COVID, we are taking it online. Bidding will begin on June 25th, online only, through Artsy. Again, you can find all the information on our website now, silvereye.org, and you can preview many of the lots that will be available for bid, starting on June 25th. Bidding closes on July 9th at 7 p.m., so please check it out. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Rafael Soldi. Rafael is a Peruvian-born, Seattle-based artist and curator. His practice centers on how queerness and masculinity intersect with larger topics of our time, such as immigration, memory, and loss. His work has been exhibited widely, and he was the curator of the amazing show at Silver Eye in 2014 called Here and Now: Queer Geographies. He is also the co-founder of the Strange Fire Collective, a website dedicated to highlighting work made by women, people of color, and queer and trans artists. It's a wonderful website, and I highly recommend you check it out. His first artist monograph, which we discuss in detail today, is called Imagine Futures, and it was published by Candor Arts in 2020. This was a really fascinating conversation that I had with Rafael. We went deep on how his work has been inspired by his childhood in Peru, his immigration to America, and how the photo booth has become a profoundly spiritual place for himself and his artwork. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Rafael Soldi, welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you about today was a new publication, actually. We had Matt Austin from Candor Arts at our book fair last year, and I love his press, and I always ask him who he's working with, and he told me that he was working with you, and I just thought it was the most perfect fit for two really creative people who I think are pushing the book form in really interesting ways. And I was like, well, what are you publishing? And he told me about this Imagine Futures project, which I think I had maybe come across on your website in some form before. And it struck me as, in some ways, a really big departure from some of your past work, and in some ways just part of the same rhythm that you've been working in for years. So, with that long preamble, can you tell us, what Imagine Futures is and how you got started on it?
Yeah, it is all of those things that you said. It is both a departure and very much in line with, sort of conceptually with my work. It started in a bit of a fragmented way. It came from a few different places. And I should say sort of conceptually it came from one place, and then formally it came from another. And it came together over time. And it's one of those projects that sort of started with an idea, and as it developed and even after it was finished, for me, it kept getting more and more complex. And, I'm a big believer that some things you bring to the table and then some things sort of develop also afterwards. Your brain kind of works in ways that you didn't know was working at the time. So you sort of pull a thread, that was in there. So Imagine Futures is a body of work that tries to to unlock and set free all of the futures that I didn't get to live in my home country of Peru, where I grew up. I was born in Lima, Peru. I lived there until I was 16. I moved to the US at that age, which is kind of an odd time to move to another country to start a new life as a teenager. I was far enough along in my life that I had some kind of a sense of what I wanted my life to look like, and had developed, strong friendships and a bit of an identity. But I was still young enough that I had time to reinvent myself, and I was still very malleable and very moldable. And something that was always hard for me growing up was that the futures that were presented to me, which were very much informed by a Catholic patriarchal type of society in Peru, was never one that I identified with. When they said, you will be a straight man, you will marry a woman, you will have children, you will be a lawyer or an architect or a engineer or whatever, like none of those things really, those were things we were hearing in school, those were things we were hearing in the media, and none of those things aligned with what I wanted. But I was too young to know what it was that I wanted. All I knew was that those things weren't for me. What happened was that I moved to the States. I was able to sort of go to art school, build the life for myself that I wanted. And then much later,
when you moved to the States, where did your family move to?
we moved to DC. My father worked for the government in Peru, and they had sent us to DC. He was in the Navy. When by the time his term was over, I was getting ready to graduate high school, and I had decided I wanted to be an artist. And it was actually my mom, which is interesting, the one who said, I don't really think that going back is a good idea for you. I think that you should stay, which is kind of, at the time I was, it was actually only a year term. So at the time I was finishing my 16th year. And I think for a Latin mother, anyone who knows Latin mothers who are very kind of protective and close to their families, for her to encourage her, young teenage son to just stay back, I think was something that I now understand to be a really courageous act. And I think she knew that I had a more meaningful future here than I did if I went back. And I really do, I think, credit her with a lot of that choice,
Well, how did that lead to getting this project started? Because it seems like the roots in this project go back a pretty long ways.
They do, but there was a big interruption because basically I moved to the US, and I tried to put as much distance between myself and my country as I could. I just became I became distant from where I was from. I didn't want anything to do with it. I didn't like it. I was happy with my new life. I loved this American dream. Like, I was very kind of happy here, and I just had no interest in engaging with Peru or with my history there or with my identity there. I felt that part of me had died, and I had just moved on. And it wasn't until I entered my 30s, the last few years, that I realized just how important that place was for me. I mean, it brought me up. It's where I spent the first half of my life, and I needed to find a way to make amends with it.
Do you think, when you talked about distancing yourself from your kind of birth country and from the part of your early life in your 20s and late teenage years, do you think of that as sort of like because I think a lot of people push away from their family and begin to build a new identity for themselves in that part of their life? Did you see that as kind of like a normal coming of age kind of moment, or did you see that as really being something deeper, like a part of your Peruvian identity that could not be reconciled with the American identity you were starting to create?
I think it was deeper because I continued to be extremely close with my family, and I have always been. So to me, it was a little bit deeper than that. It was a little bit more rooted in my own identity and in queerness, and I would say particularly in queerness, but also a dissonance between kind of Peruvian culture and American culture, which I identified a little bit more with in terms of its values and how lives are lived out here. But what happened sort of entering my 30s was that I began to imagine what my future might have looked like if I had stayed. And it really began to haunt me. I kept, these visions kept coming up, of like, what would my life had been like if I had gone back? And a lot of it came from visiting my family and starting to meet other people in Peru who were queer, who were artists, who were happy, who were doing really well. And I started to really question whether I had been naive in making these assumptions about my potential unhappiness, my future unhappiness, and realizing that maybe there could have been a situation in which I stayed and everything would be fine. So I began to have this guilt almost around it, and this constant imagining of these futures that never happened because I maybe didn't give them a chance to. And then I spoke to a lot of friends who are immigrants from other countries, and I found out that many of them experienced the same thing, that there was a similar feeling that was pretty universal for all immigrants, this constant imagining of your life, the life you left behind, and what it could have been if you hadn't left.
Mm.
And that's sort of where the root of this work was born.
I mean, that's really powerful for me, and I think that experience I can really relate to in some ways. I can certainly relate to wanting to carve out a new identity, especially as an artist in your 20s, and then in your 30s, kind of reconsidering where you're from. But of course, having where you're from be thousands of miles away in a really different culture changes things. This is a project that I would say is kind of deeply rooted in self-portraiture. How did this idea of expressing this kind of exploring the road not traveled come out in this kind of a self-portraiture project?
Yeah, it's always interesting for me to talk about self-portraiture in my work because I I sometimes forget that these are self-portraits. I really don't like picturing myself. If you look at my camera, my phone, you will find very, very few selfies. And if there are any, they're probably just like with friends or like, doing something. You won't really find any like selfies that I made of myself just
Mhm.
because. So this was actually born on a very specific night. And this is where I kind of come back to what I said earlier about the formal elements being born in one place and the conceptual elements being born somewhere else. But it was a night that I'm sure we all remember, November 2016. I was in Berlin at a residency, and it was a very strange experience to experience the presidential election of Donald Trump in another country.
Mhm.
I had been able to cast my ballot here in the U.S. Right before I left for my residency, and it was really, really odd to be outside of the country experiencing all of this through the eyes of like foreigners, and seeing a lot of Americans at bars and in the streets sort of going through this state of shock and figuring out what's going on. But it was a really eerie time. So I remember uh, we were with some friends, we watched what happened, we were all really upset, we decided to go home, and I'm walking down the street and it's completely empty, and all I can think of is everything's going to be different from now on. Everything's going to change. And I saw a photo booth, which in Berlin, they're all over the place, and they have these beautiful, old school photo booths that make both color, and they have color and black and white booths, but they're all chemistry booths. They make these beautiful pictures. And I remember stepping into one of these. It's almost like a dream. Like I barely almost remember doing it, but I remember stepping into this photo booth and thinking, I would love to imagine a future for myself and my community that is different from what's about to happen. Because
Mhm.
I knew that Donald Trump stepping in was going to mean a real change in the lives of women, of people of color, of queer people. And in a lot of ways, things haven't changed that much because I think we have been experiencing those things for a long time, but now they're being spoken about publicly in a very different way, and that brings another layer of fear and awareness. So I remember stepping into the booth, closing my eyes, and just putting, the coins in and pressing the button and just trying my hardest to imagine a future that would be different. And this strip came out that had 4 pictures of myself with my eyes closed. Didn't think of it much. Woke up the next morning, kind of found it on my nightstand, and I just thought, wow, there's something very haunting about these pictures. And I just held on to it for a few years. It just kind of rattled around from drawer to drawer, from studio to studio. And when the kind of seedlings ideas of this work came up for imagined futures, I felt that there was something very powerful in that moment of the photo booth, something very poetic.
When you say imagine futures, you generally think of the imagined future, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, like, you think about, like, what if, to use your example, what if, Hillary Clinton became president instead, and you could kind of play out that what if in your head. I don't initially think about the imaginer, right? The
Mm-hmm.
person, the act of imagining, the meditative kind of inward trance-like state that I think you have to put yourself in to create an imagined world. And so I think, one of the things, to turn the camera on yourself, to capture yourself in a moment of imagining, to show the surface of someone's face as they kind of engage in a kind of a meditation, I think is really, I mean, to me, that's just such a beautiful gesture. So once you made that photograph, how did the project grow?
Yeah, so I realized a few things kind of from there. It was that I was trying to make a body of work about something that was very abstract and something that was hard to picture, and that I wasn't really interested in going out and making pictures. When I saw that photo booth strip, it kind of clicked with me. I said, oh, this is great, because the booth can become my collaborator. The booth can become kind of my partner in making this work. It's an autonomous machine. It knows what to do. I just have to press a button and pay like $3. It's cheap,
Mm-hmm.
and and kind of go from there. And what I loved was that the booth actually set a lot of the parameters for the work. So I started, what I did was, every time one of these imagined futures visited me, I kind of think of them as ghosts or sort of these spirits. I would go and find them. I did this over the course of 2 years, all over the world, depending on where I was. And I would find a photo booth, I would step into it, and I would close my eyes and I would say, thank you for coming. Thank you for visiting me. And I give you permission to go, and to go find someone else to live you, maybe someone who's better suited than me to what you're proposing here. And so it became almost like a release of this contract. And
I mean, when you said that thank you for coming, I mean, I literally just kind of got chills when you said that. I mean, the idea of having that kind of acceptance and that kind of a grace with a thought is just really, it's just really moving to me. Can you tell me some other examples of what you're imagining in these photographs? I mean, how specific do they get? I mean, obviously the Donald Trump example is, I think, one that everyone has had in one way or
Mhm.
another. But what are some others?
Honestly, I wish I could, but I don't remember. It's been, I finished making the work about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. And this happened over the course of 2 years. But I would say more often than not, they were almost ethereal. Like, sometimes they were very concrete. Like, I would go home to Peru to visit my family, and I would meet someone, and I would think like, oh, they're kind of living the kind of life I could have lived. Or I would see something and it would kind of spark this vision of, and sometimes it was something that was very, like I said, is ethereal or abstract or emotional or spiritual. Sometimes it was from looking at childhood photos. Sometimes it was from reading something, or even seeing an artist in Peru who's making work that I thought was really strong, and thinking like, oh, maybe I could have been, I could have had a career there. Yeah, so it really kind of runs the gamut.
When you look at the photographs themselves, they are like almost too beautiful to be just photo booth photos. I mean, are these just the straight film strip photos that you cut out of the kind of printout?
They are, and I did seek. I made sort of, I created a bit of a strategy. I decided to only use traditional chemistry-based photo booths. As you know as well, photo booths are incredibly inconsistent in terms of the types of images that they make, and each booth almost has a personality. Anyone who's a photo booth enthusiast of any kind knows that every single booth is going to give you its very own kind of pictures. It's almost, to me, like every booth was an artist that I was collaborating with in a different way. So it became this really nice relationship where I didn't have to operate a camera. I didn't have to worry about making decisions in terms of technical decisions, but also like composition and what the picture might look like. I could just let go of that and focus on the things that were a little bit more important to me in this process.
In the publication, there's a really beautiful essay by Miguel Lopez, and there's a quote from you that I thought was really interesting, talking about performativity in these photographs. And you said a photo booth is also both very public and very private, a very small stage for a monumental performance. I think that's really interesting. I mean, the photo booth is such a stage. How did you think about performing these pictures?
Yeah, I do. I sort of came to think of it, like you said, as this tiny little stage. There's something very beautiful and very poetic about it, and the photo booth is inherently a space for performance. That's almost its only role. People step in there and they become not necessarily someone else. Some people maybe do more than others, but it is a space for you to perform for a camera. And I love that even though booths are by nature always in very public spaces, the minute people pull that little curtain, they feel completely transformed into a space where they can be whatever it is that they want to be. So there was something very interesting about being in that space, and such a little space holding so much room and space for this performance. And an analogy that I often make that kind of appeared for me throughout the process was that the photo booth started to remind me of a Catholic confessional.
Hmm.
And I grew up attending a Catholic school, an all boys Catholic school, for over 10 years, and grew up sort of, we weren't like super religious at home, but it is the national faith of the country. And we had to confess our sins. And as kids, we were trained, in school twice a week to go to the confessional and tell a grown man behind a curtain our deepest secrets. And like, how weird is that? I mean, that's just, and I began to find all these analogies between these two processes and how much it reminded me of being there, and thinking as a kid, like, I don't feel comfortable being in this little space with this grown man telling him my secrets. Like, why do I have to tell him, and why do I have to repent, these things? And who is he to tell me, you know, what I can do and cannot do? And then here I was in this new space that physically very closely mimicked that experience. And it was a confessional of some kind again, but this time it was on my terms. I think there's a very famous quote by James Baldwin where he said, all art is a kind of confession. And I love that. And I identify with that.
Well, and that's interesting too, because I think one of the things I had thought about looking at these photographs was they almost look like you're in prayer. And I guess prayer means a lot of things to a lot of people, but a very sincere moment of deep meditation or introspection. And in some ways, I was thinking about that word perform in the sort of the photo booth as a performative space, because I think oftentimes performative has sort of connotes maybe that what's happening isn't totally authentic, right? That it's some sort of a put on for an audience, and these feel quite sincere, right? Like not like an affect, or not like anything other than a person kind of deep in thought or deep in reflection. So I don't know. Did you ever think about a distinction between a performed moment and just a moment?
I did actually, because earlier on in the project, when I was imagining, not to use that word again, but when I was imagining what the work might look like, when I was just thinking purely formally about the images, I would go in there and I would actually perform a little bit more because I wanted the images to all feel a little bit different. I didn't want them to be too repetitive. So I would make sure to like move my face a little bit, or like I just looked at those and I was like, this is not working. Like this feels completely contrived, and it's not genuine because I'm not really thinking about what I want to be thinking about. I'm thinking about performing for the camera. I scrapped it.
You know, once you understand a little bit about the backstory of the work, there's two parts of this that really speak to me, that make it a really powerful experience for me. And, you know, one is enjoying the image. You know, they're beautiful. And I think everything you do is so elegant, right? There's just such an overwhelming elegance to the whole series and the idea. And that sort of, at one point it turned towards like, you know, what I was trying to draw out of you before is like, what are you thinking about? Which I'm so curious when I look at these pictures, you know, like, and I, you know, just the way my mind works, like I want to know all the specifics about all the futures you imagined. And in some ways it's really frustrating that they've gotten away from you. And in some ways that's like perfect, right? Because why should I get to know that? And then of course it turns it back on the viewer. You know, I think for me, the next thought is, well, what are my imagined futures? What are my moments that when I've dreamed of a different kind of a life and, you know, thought about it and let it go. And I think everyone has those kind of thoughts, and to have this almost this proposal of saying, well, you can recognize that other alternative life and kind of speak with it and let it go and thank it is just such a beautiful thing that, you know, I will definitely be embracing in my own
Yeah,
mental life.
thanks. But you know what? Something that, expanding on that, that was really important to me. The repetition became important also because even though this is about a personal experience and it does come from my story, I'm not so much interested in telling you my story. Like, I don't necessarily need the viewer to know my story. I'm interested in using my experience to speak of like larger global concerns. And I think that this idea of grieving, you know, the place you come from is very apt for so many immigrants that I've spoken to. And what I liked is that when you get up close, you see me, you see my picture. If you kind of go from one to one, you see my story. But the minute you take 2 steps back or 3 steps back, they're so small and they're so intimate and they're so repetitive that it's almost like my face disappears and it just becomes faces. It becomes people. And I like this idea of having both elements of being able to be up close and see my story, but then step back and kind of speak to this collective grief that it's not just me. You know, it's a lot of people.
And I think that comes through, you know, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, from the form being related to a passport photo or an ID card photo, or a lot of the, you know, sort of standard depiction that would be used for a traveler, for a migrant, for an immigrant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say sort of, I would even just bring it back a little bit, which is a question I get often is why did I cut them out? You know, why did I not keep the whole strip together? And that's for a couple of reasons. Primarily, it's because I felt that the strip as a whole just spoke too much of the zeitgeist of the photo booth. It connected a little too much to the kind of the pop culture elements of it. I just didn't want people to get distracted by that. I didn't want people to immediately go to like, oh, how fun, a photo booth. To me, the photo booth was just a tool for making the work. And then there was what you said, which is that it kind of connected with the aesthetics of a passport photo. So I recently heard an interview with Felix Gonzalez Torres in which he talks about his own use of passport photos and how they speak to this idea of travel and movement and a body in transit. And I love this idea of my body kind of being a vessel for these these visiting ghosts that were in transit, these futures that were in transit, maybe from me to someone else.
So one connection that I was thinking with the ID photo conversation and the photo booth conversation, the two things that really sprung to mind right away were Thomas Roof's kind of passport photos, the giant
Mm-hmm.
German kind of monuments of just faces kinds of photos. And I was also thinking about Andy Warhol and how so many of his silk screens and just so many of his kind of collected photographs came from his love of photo booths. Did you think about this work as being in conversation with any of those other kind of works?
Yes and no. I know both of those works, and I love those works. I would say of those two artists, the one that I was thinking of most was Warhol, and more in terms of I've always liked Warhol and his work, but I was thinking more in terms, how do I put this? I didn't want my work in this particular project to be compared to Warhol for the very reason that I was talking about earlier, because I thought that Warhol's use of the photo booth was much more sort of about the fun, performative nature of it. And I wanted to step away from that.
Yeah, and I think about I also think about Warhol's self-portraits in the photo booths as being, in a lot of Warhol's work, a sort of being a portrait of a performance that is masking a a sort of
So,
a sadness and insecurity.
absolutely, a self-consciousness. Yeah. Yeah. But no, I think you're making me think of it in a different way also, because I think I was very, very focused on thinking of Warhol's aesthetics and those connections. And I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about his own identity. And I have always felt the same way about his self-portraits. I've always felt that they're performative, but they mask for sure a sadness or a self-consciousness.
I would just love to hear you speak about creating a book out of this work.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said earlier, I know you worked with Matt Austin at Candor Arts to create a publication, and it is not a typical book. It has a couple of really unique qualities and how it comes together and the kind of object it is. So if you can describe, what your thought process was in creating the book.
So that book came out or came up in a really interesting way. I met Matt at the Filter Photo Festival a few years ago, and I had I had selected a bunch of reviewers that I wanted to meet with, and Matt wasn't one of them. And the reason that was because I really wasn't looking for a book. I was not. I didn't think I had any work that was book worthy at the moment, or that was really. I always imagined or I thought of books in very traditional ways. So I was like, I don't have a body of work that has 60, 75, 100 photographs to edit into a book, and I don't have a body of work that's like this kind of expansive telling of a narrative. But he was assigned to me as a reviewer. He was one of the few people. I think he was actually the only person that I hadn't requested in my list. But I was like, oh, I did a little research. I loved what they had published, and I thought, we can at least have a good conversation. So I I went up to him to the table and I said, hey, it's really nice to meet you. I really don't want a book. Um, and and mainly I just wanted him to I just kind of wanted to be like, I know that people have been pitching you their books all day, and that's not my agenda. So let's just have a conversation, but we had a great conversation about the work. And towards the end, he said to me, I really think that you have a book here. Like, I think that this could be a really interesting thing. As an artist, I guess that's kind of the dream. So many people spend years and years looking for a publisher, and I felt so lucky that such a great publisher like Candor Arts just said, hey, let's make a book of your work. What do you think? And I think, and I tell this story because I think it informed how we move forward, in the sense that they came with with an idea of how this work could become a book. And it wasn't necessarily me driving that conversation in terms of like, I want to make this, can you make it for me? And it really became this collaboration. I looked at their work, I realized that they make things that are very unconventional, very different, and that's probably why I couldn't picture this as a book before. It became a really great collaboration. They came out here to Seattle. They said, we won't make a book unless we're able to come to your studio and spend time with you and see how you live. And I mean, I credit Matt and Melanie for driving really the majority of the form of the book. One thing that I loved about working with them is that they continually reminded me that this book was an opportunity to present the work in a new way. And every time I would say things like, well, when I exhibit it, we do it like this, or the work is supposed to be this way, they would always tell me, we're not interested in making a catalog. We're interested in making an object that is a new thing that doesn't exist. And they kept reminding me, a gallery is one space, a book is another space. And that really drove the conversation. And we realized that while the work is very interesting when it's hung on the wall in terms of its form, with all these little images kind of butted up against each other, when you lay them out in a traditional book form, it's actually pretty boring. And that, we were kind of leafing through and we were like, I don't know that anyone just wants to flip through kind of page by page by page by page of these self-portraits. It's not the same. It doesn't hold the same excitement that it holds in a gallery wall. So we realized we had to complicate the work. We had to bring some complexity to how the book was constructed in order to make the experience a little bit more interesting. And in the moment, I remember him emailing me and being like, okay, I'm sending you a PDF with an idea. I think he was kind of nervous. Maybe he was like, it's kind of a departure. I don't know what you think. Just hold your thoughts until I can explain what I'm thinking. And I opened it and I was like, yeah, of course. Yes. And he called me and I was like, you don't have to say anything. I'm like, this is great. Let's do it. And it was this suggestion of this beautiful box with an unbound kind of set of contents inside of it. And it just made complete sense to me because that's what the work is about. It's this letting go, it's this freeing of these futures. And I should also mention that an anecdote that also bridges the physical work to the book and the form the book take is that when the work was traveling back to my studio from an exhibition, 2 boxes were stolen from the FedEx truck. They weren't recovered. So I lost, at first I lost 20 of the images, and then we found 6 of them in dumpsters and sidewalks and bus stops around Philadelphia, and 14 were never recovered. So I only have 36 of the 50 pieces, and they're all, they're unique, one-of-a-kind images. And I decided not to replace them, just keep the installation with 36. But I had documented them ahead of time. I had scanned them, so I had them for the book. So the book also became this memorial to, the full set of images before it was broken apart. But it also spoke to, I went through my own kind of grieving, and I was so upset when they were stolen, and it was really hard to kind of part with them. And then came to my own realization again that this is the whole point of the work. How poetic that's how they would depart, that they would find their own way. Who am I to keep them hostage here in this crate,
Wow. That's awful that the work got lost. And as a gallerist, I really feel for you, but as a poetic gesture, and again, you talking about the focus of letting go and the importance of letting go in the work, of these thoughts, of these ideas, of these futures. I think it is kind of poetically perfect. It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So
Rafael, thank you so much for sharing this work with me today.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks to Silver Eye and Kate and everybody there.